The silence in my house had a sound. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts of 30 years of living. The hum of the old refrigerator, the groan of the floorboards, the tick-tick-tick of the mantelpiece clock my wife Helen bought on our 10th anniversary. After she passed, those sounds got louder. They were the only conversation I had some days. For the last 6 months, a new sound had joined the chorus. The dull, persistent ache in my left leg. A constant reminder of how my life had been split into a before and an after. It was a throb that synced up with the rhythm of the rain tapping against the window pane. A dreary, gray Ohio afternoon that felt like it had been custom-made to match my mood. I shifted in my worn leather armchair, the one molded perfectly to my shape over thousands of evenings, and tried to find a position that didn't send a jolt of angry fire shooting up from my ankle. No such luck. The pain was a stubborn tenant, and it wasn't moving out anytime soon. It's funny, the things you remember from a moment that changes everything. I don't remember the drive to work that morning, or what I had for breakfast. But I remember the exact sound the hydraulic lift made in the shop. A sharp, metallic pop, like a giant cracking his knuckles. Then a groan, not of metal, but of something giving up, surrendering to gravity. I remember looking up from the brake line I was working on and seeing a 2-ton Ford F-150 starting to tilt. I remember the smell, hot oil, grease, and the sudden, sharp scent of my own fear. I wasn't fast enough. Not anymore. The truck didn't crush me, not completely, but it pinned my leg, and in that white-hot flash of agony, I knew my life as a mechanic was over. 44 years of turning wrenches, of honest, dirty, satisfying work, finished. Which brought me here, to this chair, to this silence, to the laptop perched awkwardly on a stack of books beside me. I winced as I leaned over to wake it up, the screen flickering to life and showing the one thing that was supposed to make it all better, the website for the Ohio Valley Credit Union, my account page. The number sat there staring back at me, so big it looked fake. 7 figures, a number with 2 commas in it. It looked less like a bank balance and more like a phone number from a place I'd never been. The settlement. The company's way of saying, "Sorry we crippled you. Here's a pile of money. Please don't talk about it." Everyone said I was lucky. "Frank, you're set for life," my old work buddies would say. "You can do anything you want now." But they didn't understand. The money felt heavy. It felt like blood money. It was the price tag for my career, for my ability to walk without a limp, for the quiet pride I used to feel coming home bone-tired and smelling of gasoline. Now I just felt bone-tired. The money wasn't a prize. It was a receipt for everything I'd lost. It sat in that account like a dragon guarding a cursed treasure, and I had no idea what to do with it. It made me feel more alone than ever. Helen would have known. She would have had a plan. She would have laughed and said, "Well, Frank, looks like we're finally taking that trip to Alaska," and just like that, the money would have had a purpose. But the only person I could talk to was the framed photo of her on the mantel, her smile as bright as the day I met her. "What do we do now, Helen?" I whispered to the empty room. The clock ticked on. My gaze drifted to the other photo on the mantel, next to Helen's. It was my daughter Jenna, on her wedding day. So beautiful, so full of hope. It was a good day, one of the last truly good days before things started to drift. Before her husband Derek's grand ideas got bigger and his results got smaller. Before my simple blue-collar life became something she was embarrassed by. I wondered what she'd think if she saw that number on my screen. I wondered if she'd even care about the leg, about the pain, about the silence. I tried to push the thought away. It was a bitter, ugly thought to have about your own kid. But it was there, lingering in the quiet corners of the house, as heavy and as unwelcome as the money itself. My eyes lingered on that wedding photo, trying to find the man I was that day. I looked stiff in that rented tuxedo, my mechanic's hands looking out of place, scrubbed clean and holding a champagne flute. But I was smiling. It was a real smile, I think. A hopeful one. I was looking at Jenna, who was radiant, her arm looped through her new husband's. Even then, though, I saw something in Derek's eyes I didn't like. It was a kind of impatient hunger, the look of a man who saw my daughter not as a partner for life, but as a beautiful acquisition, a stepping stone to something else. He had that easy charm that slick salesmen have, a firm handshake and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Helen had been wary of him from the start. "He's all polish and no wood, Frank," she'd said once. As usual, she was right. After she was gone, I was the only one left to see it, and my warnings just sounded like the bitter ramblings of a lonely old man. The real break, the moment the growing cracks in our foundation finally split the whole thing apart, came about 2 years ago on a Sunday afternoon that started deceptively peaceful. Jenna and Derek had come over, which was a rare event. They filled my small living room with an anxious energy, Derek pacing in his expensive, pristine sneakers, while Jenna sat stiffly on the edge of the couch Helen and I had bought in 1998. They made small talk for 10 minutes, asking about the house, the yard, anything but what they'd actually come for. Finally, Derek launched into it. He called it an opportunity, a ground floor investment in his latest venture. It was an app for your phone. He spoke in a flurry of buzzwords: synergy, monetization, user-driven content that meant absolutely nothing to me. He made it sound like he was inventing the next light bulb, but when I finally pinned him down, the idea was just silly. A social network for people to review the vibe of coffee shops. I listened patiently, my hands resting on my knees, feeling the familiar texture of my worn denim jeans. When he was done, he named a number, a big one, the amount he needed for seed funding, and he wanted me to co-sign the business loan. I looked from his eager, predatory face to my daughter's, who was watching me with a desperate, pleading look in her eyes, and I just couldn't do it. I shook my head slowly. "Derek," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "I've worked my whole life. I built this home, raised my family, with money I earned by the hour. Honest money, from real work. I don't understand this. This world you're talking about. It sounds like gambling with someone else's chips. It sounds like smoke." I turned to my daughter. "Jenna, honey, this isn't a sure thing. There's no such thing." I was trying to protect her. That's all I was trying to do. But she didn't see it that way. Her face, which had been tight with hope, crumpled into something ugly. It was fury. "You don't get it," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You just don't get it because you've never wanted more than this. This house, this town, this life. You're happy smelling like grease and dust, Dad, but I want more. We want more." Derek put a comforting hand on her shoulder, a smug, pitying look on his face. "He doesn't believe in you, Jenna," Derek said softly, twisting the knife. And Jenna nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He never has," she whispered, and that was the blow that knocked the wind out of me. She stood up, looking around my living room, not with nostalgia, but with disdain. "I'm sorry we're not content to just settle, like you," she said. And then they left. That was it. That was the last real conversation we ever had. After that, it was a cold, polite silence, punctuated by the occasional hollow text message on my birthday or a Christmas card with a glossy, professional photo of her perfect-looking family, all of them smiling like strangers in a magazine ad. 2 years of that polite distance, which felt 1,000 times worse than angry shouting. It was a bridge left in ruins, with both of us standing on opposite sides, too stubborn to even look at the wreckage. Now, staring at her wedding photo, the memory of that fight felt as raw as if it had happened yesterday. The resentment was a bitter taste in my mouth, but beneath it, there was the dull ache of regret. Maybe I had been too harsh. Maybe I could have found a softer way to say no. The thought gnawed at me, a familiar ghost in the heavy silence of my home. The weight of that 2-year-old memory was pressing down on me, a physical thing that made the air in the room feel thick and hard to breathe. I was lost in it, adrift in a sea of regret, when a sudden shrill noise ripped through the silence. It was my cell phone, vibrating violently against the wooden side table where I'd left it. The ringtone, a generic chime I'd never bothered to change, sounded alien and offensive in the quiet sanctuary of my home. I leaned over, my leg protesting the movement, and picked it up. The name on the screen sent a jolt through my system that was sharper than any nerve pain. "Jenna." My thumb hovered over the green accept button, a dozen different emotions warring for control. Part of me wanted to just let it ring, to let it go to voicemail and dissolve back into the comfortable misery I was used to. But a deeper, more foolish part, the part that was still a father above all else, couldn't do it. With a shaky breath, I answered. "Dad?" The voice was impossibly bright, cheerful, and so utterly foreign that for a second I thought I had the wrong number. It was the voice she used for customer service, for PTA meetings, for strangers she wanted to impress. It wasn't the voice of my daughter. "Jenna, I managed, my own voice sounding rough and unused. Everything okay? Oh, everything's fine. Better than fine, she chirped. There was a pause, a breath, as if she was consulting a script. Listen, Dad, I know things have been weird between us. For a while now. I've just been so stressed with the kids, and Derek's new project has been absolutely all-consuming, and I haven't been the best at keeping in touch. I'm really sorry. It was a textbook non-apology, blaming everything but herself, but the word sorry was still in there, and my heart, against all logic, snagged on it. It's all right, I said, a lie that tasted like ash. And then I heard about your accident at the shop, she continued, her tone shifting to one of practiced sympathy. Mom's old friend Carol told me. It sounds just awful. I can't believe you didn't call me. You must be so bored just rattling around in that big house all by yourself. The phrase rattling around stung more than she could ever know, painting a picture of me as some forgotten ghost in my own life. But before I could respond, she barreled on, her enthusiasm ramping up. Which is exactly why I'm calling. We can't have you cooped up in there feeling sorry for yourself. So, we all decided that we're going to throw you a party. I was silent, the word party echoing in my brain. It made no sense. It was like a puzzle piece from a completely different box. A party? Yes, a welcome home from the hospital party. I know you weren't in the hospital long, but it's the idea of it, you know? To celebrate you, to get you out of the house, to finally see the grandkids. They miss their grandpa so much. The manipulation was so layered, so deceptively thoughtful, that it was almost a work of art, a party for me, a celebration of my recovery. How could I say no to that without sounding like a bitter, ungrateful old coot? How could I reject an olive branch that was wrapped in so much love and concern, even if every instinct in my body was screaming that the branch was poison ivy? A voice in the back of my head, the cynical one that had been my only companion for months, was screaming warnings. 2 years of nothing and now a party? Right after the settlement? Don't be a fool, Frank. But the hope, God, the hope was so much louder. It was a starving man seeing a feast, even if he suspected it was a mirage. I pictured my grandkids, Lily and Mason. I pictured Jenna smiling at me, a real smile, not the one from the glossy Christmas card. I pictured a bridge being rebuilt, stone by painful stone, over the chasm that had opened up between us. Maybe the accident had scared her. Maybe the thought of almost losing her dad, as distant as he'd become, had put things in perspective. People change, right? Weren't families worth giving the benefit of the doubt? I was convincing myself, talking down the logical part of my brain with the desperate, emotional part that just wanted his family back. Dad, are you there? Jenna's voice cut through my thoughts, a hint of impatience now coloring her cheerful tone. Yeah, I said, my voice quiet. Yeah, honey, I'm here. So? This Saturday. Our place. Around 5? I took a breath, closing my eyes and seeing my daughter's face, not as the angry woman who had stormed out of my house, but as the gap-toothed 7-year-old beaming with pride as I showed her how a ratchet worked. That was the memory I chose to hold on to. That was the version of my daughter I chose to believe in. I'll be there, I said. Thank you. After we hung up, the silence that rushed back in felt different. It wasn't the heavy, stagnant quiet of before. It was a nervous, buzzing silence, humming with a fragile, terrifying thing I hadn't felt in a very long time. Anticipation. I looked over at the photo on the mantel, and for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't just seeing a painful memory. I was seeing a possibility, a chance. And I decided, right then and there, to take it. The 2 days leading up to the party were a strange mix of anxiety and a hope so bright it was almost painful. I spent the time puttering around the house, tidying up things that were already tidy, oiling hinges that didn't squeak. It was nervous energy, the kind a man gets when he's about to ask a girl on a first date, or in my case, try to restart a relationship with his own daughter. My mind was made up. I was going to walk into her house with an open heart and a real, substantial gesture of goodwill. Not just a token gift, but something meaningful. Something that said I was invested in their future, in my grandkids' future. That's what brought me to the Ohio Valley Credit Union on Friday afternoon, the day before the party. The place hadn't changed much in 30 years. Same speckled linoleum floor, same faint smell of old paper and stale coffee. It was a place of comforting routine, and I felt my nerves settle a bit as I took my place in line, deposit slip in hand. I was waiting my turn, leaning a bit on the counter to take the weight off my leg, when a familiar voice cut through the quiet murmur of the bank. It was loud, arrogant, and laced with a kind of theatrical indignation that could only belong to one person, my son-in-law, Derek. He was at the next teller window, dressed in a blazer and jeans that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to. He was arguing, his voice bouncing off the high ceiling for everyone to hear. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is a simple overdraft fee. It's clearly a technical error on your end. We have significant capital assets pending transfer, and this kind of administrative incompetence is frankly unacceptable." I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I instinctively took a step back, trying to shrink behind a promotional stand advertising auto loans. The young woman behind the counter was holding her ground, her expression a masterclass in professional patience. "Sir, your account was overdrawn by $73 when the automatic payment went through. The card was declined this morning at the gas station. The fee is standard, $73. He was causing this scene, humiliating himself and the young teller, over $73. And then he played his final desperate card. "My father-in-law is Frank Miller. He's one of your most valued members here. I'm sure if you just look him up, you'll see that this is all a ridiculous misunderstanding." He said my name like it was a key, a magic word that should unlock special privileges. I felt my stomach clench into a tight, angry knot. This was the man who accused me of not being ambitious enough, of not understanding the world of high finance, and here he was, trying to use my name to bully a teller over a tank of gas. He finally gave up, snatching his debit card from the counter and storming out of the credit union, so lost in his own self-importance that he didn't even see me standing 10 feet away. When my turn came, I walked up to the next window. The teller was a young woman named Chloe, according to her name tag. She had kind eyes but looked exhausted. She gave me a small, professional smile. "How can I help you today, Mr. Miller?" she asked. She knew my name. Of course she did. A 7-figure settlement in a small-town credit union was probably the talk of the break room. I pushed my slip across the counter, my hands feeling clumsy. I was withdrawing a large sum of cash, enough to buy 2 top-of-the-line bikes for the grandkids and still have plenty left over. It felt foolish now, after what I'd just witnessed. Chloe processed the transaction without a word, her movements quick and efficient. She counted the bills twice, bundled them neatly, and slid the thick envelope into a larger bank pouch for me. As I reached for it, she leaned forward ever so slightly, her professional smile gone, replaced by an expression of genuine concern. Her voice was barely a whisper, meant for me and me alone. "Mr. Miller," she said, her eyes flicking for a split second toward the door Derek had just exited through. "I probably shouldn't be saying this, but please, be careful." She looked me straight in the eye, and the exhaustion I'd seen before was now a look of profound sincerity. When a lot of money comes into a family, especially when things are tight, it can make people act differently. A settlement like yours, some people might see it as a solution to their own problems. I stood there, my hand frozen on the counter. She had no idea what she had just done. She had taken the vague, shadowy suspicion I'd been fighting against and dragged it out into the harsh, fluorescent light of the bank lobby. She had given it a voice. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, a single, jerky movement. I took the pouch of money, the cash inside suddenly feeling like a lead weight, and walked out of the credit union. The fragile hope I had so carefully constructed over the last 2 days was cracking, and a cold, creeping dread began to seep in through the fissures. I didn't drive away. I couldn't. I just sat there in the driver's seat of my old Chevy pickup, the engine silent, the credit union's glass doors reflecting the dull gray sky. The bank pouch sat on the passenger seat next to me, a lump of silent accusation. It was no longer a gift. It was evidence. Chloe's soft-spoken warning echoed in my ears, playing on a loop, harmonizing with the memory of Derek's loud, obnoxious voice. A settlement like yours, some people might see it as a solution to their own problems. The pieces were all there, scattered on the table, and they were forming a picture I didn't want to see. A daughter who only calls when the money comes in. A son-in-law getting his card declined for a tank of gas. A surprise party out of the blue. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a conspiracy. My hand reached for the ignition key. my knuckles white. A fool and his money are soon parted, my own father used to say. And you, Frank Miller, are being the biggest fool of them all. I could feel the anger starting to bubble up, hot and thick in my chest. Anger at them for their transparent, insulting scheme. But mostly, anger at myself for wanting to believe it so badly. For being so weak, so lonely, that a few sweet words from a daughter I barely knew anymore were enough to make me forget 2 years of cold silence. The hopeful feeling I'd nurtured since her phone call now felt like a sickness, a self-inflicted delusion. All I had to do was turn the key, put the truck in reverse, go home, and put the money back in the vault where it belonged. I would block her number. I would let the silence return, but this time it would be on my terms. It would be a shield, not a punishment. My fingers closed around the key, but I didn't turn it. My hand was frozen in place, stopped by something stronger than logic, more powerful than anger. A ghost from a sunny Saturday afternoon almost 25 years ago. The memory ambushed me, appearing so vividly it was like a movie was playing on the inside of my dusty windshield. It was the summer Jenna turned 10. My old Ford Fairmont had gotten a flat right in the driveway, and I was getting out the jack and the spare. Jenna came out of the house, all skinny arms and scraped knees, and just stood there watching me, her head cocked to the side. "What are you doing, Daddy?" she'd asked. "Changing a tire, kiddo," I'd said. "Want to learn?" Her eyes lit up. Not with the polite, feigned interest she'd show later in life, but with genuine, sparkling curiosity. I spent the next hour showing her everything. How to brace the jack, how to get the hubcap off without scratching it, how to position the lug wrench for the best leverage. I showed her the old trick. Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Her small hands struggled against the stubborn, rusted on nuts. I could have done it for her in 10 seconds, but I didn't. I watched her put all her wiry strength into it, her face scrunched up in intense concentration, a little grunt of effort escaping her lips. And then, pop! The nut broke free. Her head snapped up, and she looked at me with wide, triumphant eyes. "I did it!" She did the rest herself. When it was all done, the flat tire replaced with the spare, she stood back, hands on her hips, surveying her work. She was covered in dirt, a perfect smudge of black grease across her nose, her ponytail coming undone, and she was beaming. She was glowing with a kind of pride that you can't buy, a pride that only comes from doing something real, something with your own 2 hands. She looked at me, her hero, to see if I was proud of her too. And the love I felt in that moment, it was a physical force, an ache in my chest so profound it almost brought me to my knees. That was my Jenna. Curious, determined, real. A girl who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. The memory faded, leaving me alone again in the silence of my truck. The bank and the gray sky returned. Where did that little girl go? Was she still in there somewhere, buried under years of bad advice from a fool husband and a world that told her that appearances were more important than substance? Was the woman with the fake cheerful voice on the phone a stranger, or was she just my little girl, lost and pretending to be someone she wasn't? Chloe's warning was the truth, I knew it was. The party was almost certainly a trap, but the ghost of that 10-year-old girl, with the grease on her nose, wouldn't let me go. I couldn't save that little girl, but maybe, just maybe, I owed it to her to give the woman she'd become one last chance to prove me wrong. I wasn't going for the woman on the phone, I was going for her. My fingers slowly uncurled from the ignition key. My decision was made. It wasn't a happy one. The fragile hope was gone, replaced by a grim, heavy resolve. I wasn't walking into a loving family reunion anymore. I was walking into enemy territory, with my eyes wide open, on a mission to find a ghost. I picked up the bank pouch from the passenger seat, the cash inside no longer feeling like a gift, but like bait. I started the truck, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out of the parking lot, not turning toward home, but toward the mall. I was still going to buy those bikes. But now, they weren't a peace offering. They were part of a test. I drove for maybe 10 minutes, the pouch of cash sitting on the passenger seat like an unwanted stranger. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my destination was the Northwood Mall, the place you went to buy things you didn't need. I was on autopilot, still planning to buy those bicycles for Lily and Mason, but the act felt hollow now. It felt wrong. A bicycle is a wonderful thing for a kid, but what was it really? A toy. Something that would be shiny and new for a month before it got scratched. left out in the rain and eventually outgrown. More than that, it was a commodity. It was something Derek and Jenna could easily return for cash, a few $100s to plug the ever-leaking holes in their financial ship. It was a gift that played right into their hands, a gesture they could easily melt down for their own purposes. The thought soured in my stomach. I wasn't going to hand them a weapon to use against me, no matter how shiny and kid-friendly it looked. Suddenly, I knew what I had to do. The realization was a quiet click, like a well-machined part locking into place. I wasn't going to give them a gift they wanted. I was going to give them a gift they needed, a gift that reflected my values, not theirs. A gift that was solid, lasting, and couldn't be frittered away on some get-rich-quick fantasy or a fancy dinner to impress their friends. I made a hard, decisive turn at the next intersection, the old Chevy groaning in protest, and headed back toward the credit union. The dread I'd felt in the parking lot was still there, but now it was mixed with something new, a cold, clear sense of purpose. I walked back into the bank, feeling the eyes of the tellers on me. I avoided Chloe's window, not wanting to get her into any more trouble, and went to an older woman at the far end of the counter. I pushed the still full pouch of cash toward her. "I'd like to get a cashier's check, please," I said, my voice steady. The amount I requested made her raise her eyebrows, but she processed it without a word. As she typed into her computer, I thought about the sheer beautiful practicality of it. You can't pay for a fancy brunch with a 529 college savings plan. You can't buy a new designer purse with a legacy. Derek and Jenna didn't want a foundation for their kids' future. They wanted a quick cash infusion to prop up their crumbling present, and I was about to give them a choice. I was about to hand them a block of solid granite and see if they were grateful for the foundation, or just angry that it wasn't gold. "Who should I make it payable to?" the teller asked. "Jenna and Derek Collins," I said. Then I added the most important part. "And in the memo line, could you please write, 'For Lily and Mason Collins, 529 College Fund.'" She nodded and typed it in. Seeing those words on her screen felt like a small victory. It was a directive, a mission statement. It was me, in my own quiet way, trying to steer the ship. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, the cashier's check lying in front of me. $50,000. It was a staggering amount of money, more than I used to make in a year of hard labor. It was a chunk of my pain, a piece of my sacrifice, converted into paper. I picked out a card from a box Helen had kept in her desk. It wasn't a fancy, glittery card. It was simple, a picture of a sturdy-looking oak tree on the front. Inside, I didn't write a long, sentimental message. My hand wasn't steady enough for that, and my heart wasn't open enough. I just wrote 5 simple words. A future for my grandkids. I signed it. "Love, Grandpa." I stared at the word love for a long time. Was it true? Yes, of course it was, but it was a different kind of love now. It was a tough, worried love. It was the love that makes a father check the oil and the tire pressure before his kid goes on a long road trip. It's not the flashy, exciting part of the journey. It's the boring, essential part that keeps you safe. I folded the check, tucked it inside the card, and sealed the envelope. It felt heavier than the pouch of cash had. This wasn't just a gift. It was a test. It was a final, desperate appeal to the ghost of the little girl with grease on her nose. Maybe, just maybe, when she held this solid, concrete proof of a future for her own kids, something of that little girl would recognize the value in it. It was a sliver of hope, but it wasn't the blind, naive hope of a few days ago. It was a mechanic's hope, the kind you have when you've done everything you can, replaced all the worn-out parts, and you turn the key, praying the engine will turn over. Pulling up to Jenna's house always felt like visiting a foreign country. My old Chevy pickup looked like a rusted-out workhorse next to the sleek, silent SUVs parked in the driveway, all of them gleaming under the strategically placed landscape lighting. The house itself was enormous, a beige vinyl box with too many pointy roof lines and a 3-car garage. It was a place built to be looked at, not lived in. The lawn was unnervingly perfect, a carpet of manicured green that probably never felt a bare foot or a stray dandelion. As I limped my way up the pristine concrete walkway, the sealed envelope in my jacket pocket felt like a cold, heavy stone. My resolve was set. I was an observer, a judge, a father conducting one final, painful test. I was ready for anything, or so I thought. I hadn't even reached the top step when the front door flew open. Jenna stood there, framed in the warm, golden light from inside. "Dad!" she cried out, her voice thick with an emotion I hadn't heard in years. Before I could even process it, she rushed forward and threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in the collar of my flannel shirt. Her hug wasn't polite or hesitant. It was a desperate, clinging embrace, and I could feel a tremor run through her. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining with what looked, for all the world, like real tears. "I was so worried you wouldn't come," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup my cheek. "I'm so happy you're here." My carefully constructed defenses began to creak and groan like old timbers in a storm. This wasn't the cold, calculating woman I had prepared for. This was my daughter. Derek appeared behind her, all smiles and sincerity. He placed a firm, welcoming hand on my shoulder. "Frank, it is so good to see you. Welcome. Let me get your coat." The house behind them was buzzing with life. It was full of people, maybe 20 or 30 of them, all dressed in smart casual weekend attire. They were laughing, holding wine glasses, and a wave of warm, cheerful noise washed over me. As Derek led me inside, a few of them turned and smiled. "So this is the man of the hour," one man said, raising his glass to me. "It's great to finally meet you." I was disoriented, overwhelmed. This wasn't a trap, it was an ambush of warmth and affection. And just when I thought I might get my bearings, they deployed their heavy artillery. "Grandpa!" Two small bodies shot out from the living room and collided with my legs. It was Lily and Mason. They wrapped their arms around my knees, their faces upturned and beaming. "We made you cards!" Lily shouted, thrusting a folded piece of construction paper into my hand. On it was a wobbly crayon drawing of a stick figure with a smiley face, me under a scribbled banner that read, "Welcome home, Grandpa." Mason's was a near-identical masterpiece. "Mommy said your leg has a big boo-boo," Mason said, his small face scrunched up with serious 5-year-old concern. "Is it all better now?" And just like that, the dam broke. The grim resolve, the suspicion, the cold, analytical purpose I had built up over the last 2 days, it all washed away in an instant. You can't fake that. You can't coach that kind of pure, innocent affection into a child's eyes. My throat grew tight, and I had to blink back the moisture gathering in my own eyes. I knelt down, my bad leg protesting, and pulled them both into a real hug, burying my face in their hair that smelled like kid shampoo and cookies. The cold stone in my pocket now just felt like a piece of paper in an envelope. I was wrong. I had been completely, utterly, unforgivably wrong. The whole drive over I had been painting a picture of my daughter as some kind of monster, a greedy, manipulative schemer. But the reality was right here in front of me. She was a daughter who missed her father, who was maybe clumsy and awkward in showing it after so much time, but whose heart was in the right place. Derek wasn't a con artist. He was just a loudmouth who was bad with money, and maybe he was trying to clean up his act. The teller at the bank, Chloe, she meant well, but she didn't know my family. She saw a few puzzle pieces and put them together into the wrong picture. A profound, bone-deep relief settled over me, so powerful it almost made me dizzy. The weight I had been carrying, the ugly suspicion and the acidic resentment, it all lifted. I had my family back. The rest of the hour was a blur of introductions to Jenna and Derek's smiling friends, of accepting a cold beer from my son-in-law, of sitting in a comfortable armchair with Lily on my lap, as she chattered on about her friends at school. I looked across the room at Jenna as she moved through the party, a perfect hostess, and every few minutes she would catch my eye and give me a radiant, genuine smile. The joy I felt was pure and overwhelming. I had walked through the door expecting a battle, and instead, I had walked into a homecoming. For a solid hour, I let myself believe. I floated on the warm currents of the party, a beer in my hand, my grandson Mason showing me the intricacies of a new Lego creation. I listened to stories from Jenna's friends, nodding and smiling, feeling for the first time in years like a part of a community, like a patriarch. The joy was so potent, so absolute, that it felt like it had burned away all the doubt and suspicion. But a perfect, seamless surface can't last. Sooner or later you start to notice the hairline cracks. The first one appeared in a conversation with one of Derek's friends, a loud, backslapping guy named Rick who apparently sold high-end real estate. He clapped me on the shoulder, his voice a little too loud from the wine. "Frank, "It's a real honor to meet you," he boomed. "Jenna and Derek have been talking about this party for weeks. It's great to see them so happy. Jenna was just telling me the other day that your retirement is going to be a real game changer for the whole family. It's wonderful to see their ship finally coming in." He grinned, taking a big gulp of his wine, completely oblivious to the sudden chill that shot down my spine. A game changer for them? Their ship coming in? It was a strange choice of words. It wasn't about my recovery or my well-being. It was about how my situation was going to benefit them. I tried to brush it off. People say clumsy things at parties. He probably just misspoke. But the words stuck in my mind like burrs, snagging on the fabric of my newfound comfort. I smiled a tight, polite smile and excused myself, the first prickle of my old unease returning. Once you spot one crack, you start seeing them everywhere. I started watching Derek. While Jenna was the perfect hostess, flitting from group to group, making sure everyone's glass was full, Derek was agitated. He was trying to play the part of the relaxed host, but his performance was slipping. I saw him check his watch 3 times in the span of 10 minutes. He kept glancing at the front door, at his phone, at me. He looked less like a man enjoying a party and more like a nervous quarterback waiting for the snap. At one point, I saw him pull Jenna into the hallway. Their conversation was hushed and intense, their body language tight. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the tension in their shoulders. Then, Jenna saw me looking. They both immediately broke apart, their faces snapping into wide, brilliant smiles, as if a switch had been flipped. It was too fast, too perfect. It was the kind of sudden change you see in bad actors on a stage. The knot of suspicion in my gut, the one I thought had dissolved, began to slowly reform. My beer was empty, so I headed for the kitchen, using the trip as an excuse to clear my head. The kitchen was a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and granite, a showroom from a magazine. It was also, I noticed, impeccably clean except for one thing. I opened a drawer, looking for a bottle opener. It was the junk drawer, every house has one. And stuffed underneath a mess of takeout menus, rubber bands, and old batteries was a thick stack of envelopes. My hand stilled. They weren't junk mail. They had those little clear windows on the front, and angry-looking red ink peeking through. I pulled the stack out just enough to see the top few. A car payment for their luxury SUV stamped paste due, a credit card statement from a high-end department store with a balance that made my eyes water, stamped final notice. And at the very bottom, an official-looking envelope from the mortgage company. The illusion of this perfect, successful life, the very foundation of this big, beautiful house, was a lie. What I saw at the bank wasn't a one-time fluke. It was a full-blown financial crisis they were hiding under a thin veneer of weekend hospitality. I shoved the drawer closed, just as Jenna breezed into the kitchen, a bright smile on her face. "Dad, can I get you another beer?" she asked, her voice as cheerful as ever. I forced a smile back, my face feeling stiff and unnatural, like a mask. "Sure, honey. That'd be great." As she reached into the gleaming refrigerator, I backed out of the kitchen. The happy chatter from the living room no longer sounded like a celebration. It sounded like a distraction, like the loud music in a magic show, designed to keep you from seeing the trick. The joy and relief I had felt just minutes before had completely evaporated, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty that I had not been wrong. I hadn't been cynical. I had been right. This wasn't a homecoming. It was a stage, and I was beginning to understand that the final act had been written long before I arrived. I walked back into the living room, a fresh beer in my hand that I didn't want, the bottle cold and slick against my palm. I forced the muscles in my face into the shape of a smile and rejoined the party, but on the inside, I was a wreck. The cheerful noise of the room was a physical assault, each burst of laughter a fresh wave of nausea. The smiling faces of Jenna's friends seemed predatory, their eyes glinting with a knowledge I wasn't supposed to have. I felt like a man walking through a minefield, with every step threatening to detonate the terrible truth I'd found in that kitchen drawer. I needed to get out of the main room, to find a quiet corner where I could breathe and think. My opportunity came in the form of my grandson. Mason, who was only 5, was starting to wilt. The excitement of the party had worn off, and he was rubbing his eyes, his head drooping against Jenna's arm as she talked to a neighbor. She was trying to juggle her conversation, and her tired child, the perfect hostess mask, stretched thin. I saw my opening. I limped over to them, putting a hand on Mason's back. He looks like he's running on fumes, I said to Jenna, my voice sounding unnaturally normal. Why don't you let me take him upstairs? I can read him a story, get him settled in. You stay here and enjoy your party. Jenna looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance at the interruption, maybe, but it was instantly replaced by a brilliant smile. Oh, Dad, would you? That would be such a help. You're the best. She handed him over, and Mason, limp with exhaustion, curled into my arms without protest. Carrying him up the carpeted stairs felt like a sacred duty. In my arms, he was just a little boy, warm and trusting, his small breaths puffing against my neck. His innocence was a stark contrast to the cloying phoniness of the party downstairs. The upstairs hallway was dark and quiet. Jenna pointed me to his room, a place that looked like it had been decorated by a committee. Everything was brand new, in tasteful shades of gray and navy blue. A designer crib, a bookshelf with perfectly arranged, unread-looking books. It was a beautiful room, but it had no soul, none of the lived-in chaos of Jenna's childhood bedroom. I sat in the rocking chair in the corner and picked a book about a friendly dinosaur. I read in a low, quiet murmur, the familiar cadence of a bedtime story calming my own frayed nerves. Mason was asleep before I'd even finished the third page, his small body heavy and relaxed against my chest. For a moment, a wave of pure, uncomplicated love washed over me, and the ugly suspicions faded. This was real. This little boy in my arms was real. I held him for a few extra minutes, soaking in the quiet peace, before gently laying him down in his crib. As I tucked the blanket around him, a faint, crackling sound caught my ear. I looked over at the changing table. A baby monitor. The parent unit was on, its little green power light glowing in the dim light of the nursery. I could hear the tinny, distorted sound of the party downstairs. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses. My first instinct was to switch it off, to preserve the quiet sanctuary of the room. I reached for the power button, but just as my finger touched it, a voice cut through the static, sharp and clear. It was Jenna. Her voice was completely different, stripped of all its forced cheerfulness. It was flat, impatient, and cold. "Is he ready yet?" she asked. Rick said he looked a little spooked after he came out of the kitchen. "Did he see the bills? Did you leave them out?" My hand froze. I felt the blood drain from my face. Derek's voice answered, lower and smoother, but just as cold. "Relax. The kids sealed the deal. I saw his face when they gave him the cards. He's putty in our hands. He's so softened up. He'll be emotional when you give him the pitch." The air in my lungs turned to ice. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. I was paralyzed, an unwilling spy in my own grandson's bedroom. "I don't want emotional, Derek," Jenna's voice snapped back. "I want a signature." That final notice from the mortgage company wasn't a suggestion. We need his signature tonight. "He'll sign," Derek said with a dismissive sigh. The casual confidence in his voice was the most horrifying part. "Give him another 20 minutes, let him finish that beer. Then you go in and you present the family legacy investment papers. It's perfect. He'll think he's being a responsible grandpa, securing his grandkids' future. He'll have no idea he's funding our escape from this financial hellhole." Jenna hesitated. "What if he wants a lawyer to look at it?" Derek let out a short, cruel laugh that crackled through the small speaker. It was the ugliest sound I had ever heard. "A lawyer? Jenna, be serious. The man is a mechanic who got lucky. He probably thinks a 401k is a type of cleaning solvent. He is so pathetic and so desperate for his little girl to love him again that he would sign his own financial death warrant if you asked him to. He's not signing a document, honey. He's buying back your love. And for a lonely old man sitting on a pile of cash, that's a bargain." The word pathetic landed like a physical blow. It knocked the last bit of air from my lungs. I gripped the edge of the crib, my knuckles turning white, the wood biting into my palm. The constant nagging pain in my leg vanished, replaced by a vast, empty numbness that spread through my entire body. It was true, all of it. Every cynical, ugly suspicion was not only true, but it was worse than I had ever imagined. They didn't just want my money. They had contempt for me. They saw my love for my daughter as a pathetic weakness to be exploited. My grief, my loneliness, my hope, it was all just leverage to them. I stood there in the dark, silent room, staring at the perfect, untouched toys on the shelf. The only sound was the soft, innocent breathing of my grandson, a boy they were using as a pawn in their disgusting game. The baby monitor on the table continued to broadcast the sounds of the party, the sounds of my own execution. The ghost of the little girl with grease on her nose didn't just die in that moment. I realized she had been dead for a very, very long time, and I had been mourning a stranger. For how long I stood there in that silent, perfect nursery, I'll never know. Time seemed to stop, the world reduced to the soft breathing of my grandson and the tinny, cruel laughter still echoing in my head from the baby monitor. The numbness was a mercy at first, a protective shell of disbelief that held the real pain at bay. I felt detached, like I was floating near the ceiling, watching some poor old fool in a flannel shirt get his heart ripped out. But the numbness couldn't last. It was a temporary anesthetic, and it was already starting to wear off. The pain, when it finally broke through, was a white-hot agony that dwarfed the physical torment of my leg. It was the pain of total, absolute betrayal. Every kind word, every hug, every tear from Jenna, every welcoming smile from Derek, it all replayed in my mind, but now tainted, twisted into grotesque parodies of affection. The handmade cards from my grandkids were no longer treasures, they were props. The party wasn't a celebration, it was an ambush. And the words from the monitor, pathetic, desperate, his own financial death warrant, they were the nails being hammered into the coffin of the man I thought I was, the father I thought I had. But then something else began to happen. As the waves of pain washed over me, they started to carry the grief and the shock away, and what was left behind on the shore wasn't sand. It was jagged, solid rock. The pain began to cool, to harden. It wasn't the explosive, shouting rage of a younger man. This was different. It was a cold fury, a quiet, intensely focused anger that settled deep in my bones. It was the kind of cold that burns. It was the fury of a quiet man who had been pushed past his limit, of a mechanic who sees a beautifully polished engine and knows, with absolute certainty, that it is rotten from the inside out. And with that fury came a clarity so sharp it felt like I was seeing the world for the first time. The fog of hope and sentimentality I'd been living in for days was burned away. I saw Jenna and Derek not as my flawed daughter and her foolish husband, but as they truly were, two desperate, predatory strangers. I saw their smiles for the bared teeth they were, and their kindness for the bait it was. I was no longer a father wrestling with his feelings. I was a mechanic who had just completed a full diagnostic on a failed system. The diagnosis was terminal, and now my only job was to figure out how to safely and cleanly decommission the entire machine before the whole thing blew up in my face. I took a deep, steadying breath. I walked out of the nursery, closing the door gently behind me so as not to wake Mason. I went into the upstairs bathroom, a room so clean it looked like it had never been used, and I looked at my own reflection in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't the pathetic, desperate fool from Derek's description. His face was pale, his eyes were haunted, but behind the shock there was something new. A hardness, a resolve made of steel. My hands were still a mechanic's hands, calloused and capable. They knew how to take things apart just as well as they knew how to put them back together. I splashed cold water on my face, straightened the collar of my shirt, and ran a hand through my thinning hair. I practiced a smile in the mirror. It was a terrible, empty thing, but it would have to do. I was building a mask, piece by piece, arranging my features into an expression of pleasant, fatherly contentment. It was my turn to put on a performance. Walking back down those stairs was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The cheerful party noise that had once been a warm blanket was now the grating sound of a lie. Every smiling face was a potential enemy. As I reached the bottom step, one of Jenna's friends, a woman in a bright yellow dress, stopped me. "Oh, there you are. We were just talking about you. Jenna is so thrilled you could make it." I summoned the empty smile I'd practiced. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," I said, and my voice was so calm, so steady, it surprised even me. "She's a wonderful daughter." The woman beamed, completely fooled. I moved back toward the armchair where I'd been sitting earlier, which now felt like my command post. Jenna saw me from across the room, and her face lit up with a brilliant, predatory eagerness. She saw her mark returning to the table. She came over, her eyes shining with false concern. "Everything okay, Dad? Mason go down all right? I looked at this stranger wearing my daughter's face. Like a light, I said, my smile feeling more natural now, more practiced. He's a great kid, Jenna. You and Derek have done a wonderful job. I let my eyes sweep across the room, across the friends and the food and the facade. It's really good to be here, I said, meeting her gaze directly. It's good to see you so happy. The lie felt effortless. The game wasn't over. They had just shown me their entire hand, and now it was my turn to play. I settled back into the chair, took a slow sip of my beer, and waited. The party began to thin out. Guests came over to say their goodbyes, shaking my hand and telling me how wonderful it was to see Jenna so happy to have her father back in her life. Each handshake, each well-meaning comment, was another layer of absurdity piled onto this grotesque charade. I smiled. I nodded. I played the part of the beloved patriarch to perfection, all the while feeling the cold, hard weight of the envelope in my jacket pocket and the even colder resolve in my heart. I watched as Jenna and Derek exchanged a look across the room. It was subtle, just a quick flick of the eyes, but I knew what it meant. The audience was leaving. It was time for the final act. Jenna approached me, her movements practiced and smooth. In her hands, she held an elegant dark blue leather folder. It looked official, expensive, and completely out of place in my world. She sat on the ottoman in front of my armchair, leaning forward with an expression of earnest sincerity that she had probably practiced in the mirror. Derek hovered a few feet away, pretending to tidy up some empty glasses, but his attention was focused on us with laser-like intensity. They were a hunting team, moving in for the kill. "Dad," Jenna began, her voice soft and full of manufactured emotion. "I know tonight has been a lot, but there was one more thing I wanted to talk to you about, something really important." She placed the folder on my knees. It was surprisingly heavy. "Ever since your accident, and with, the settlement, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about legacy." She used that word, legacy, like it was a sacred object. That money is your life's work, in a way. It's the reward for all your years of breaking your back for us. It needs to be protected. It needs to grow. For the kids. For all of us. As a family. I looked down at the folder, then back up at her, arranging my face into a look of quiet awe. Inside, my mind was a whirlwind of ice and fire. My life's work? You think this money is a prize? This is the payment for my pain, for the end of my life as I knew it. But on the outside, I was just a simple man, touched by his daughter's incredible thoughtfulness. She opened the folder for me. Inside were pages of thick, creamy paper, covered in dense legal text, with neat little sign here tabs sticking out from the edges. It was a professional job, I had to give them that. "I had a financial advisor, a friend of Derek's, draw this up," she explained, tracing a line of text with her perfectly manicured finger. "It's a family legacy investment trust. It puts your settlement into a managed fund that's protected from taxes and liabilities. It guarantees that the money will be there for Lily and Mason's education, for our family's security, for generations to come. The best part is, we would all manage it together. You, me, and Derek. As a board. It would be something we could do together. A new start for us." There it was. The whole beautifully wrapped trap. The promise of family, of purpose, of being a respected elder managing his fortune, all in exchange for my signature on a document that would undoubtedly give them complete control of every last cent. Derek had drifted closer, a proud proprietary smile on his face. He pulled a heavy, expensive-looking pen from his jacket pocket and offered it to me. The final prop. I let out a long, shaky breath, a perfect imitation of a man overwhelmed by emotion. I looked from the papers to Derek and finally to Jenna. I let my eyes get a little misty. I reached out and put my hand over hers, on top of the open folder. "Jenna," I said, my voice cracking just right, I don't know what to say." I could feel her hand tense with anticipation under mine. Derek leaned in, unable to hide his eagerness. "After all this time, after how distant we've been, for you to be thinking about my future, about our family's future like this, it means the world to me, honey. It really does." I saw the flicker of triumph in their eyes. They had him. The pathetic old fool was hooked, gaffed, and being dragged into the boat. They thought the fight was over. I looked down at the signature line, then back up at them, my expression shifting to one of serious contemplation. This is a lot to take in, I said, shaking my head as if in wonder. In a good way, of course. This is the biggest financial decision of my entire life. I closed the folder slowly, deliberately. This deserves more than just a quick signature at a party. Their smiles tightened almost imperceptibly. Could I paused, looking from Jenna to Derek. Could I just have a few minutes alone to look this over properly? Maybe in your office? I just want to sit with it for a moment to give it the respect it deserves. The relief that washed over their faces was staggering. It was like they'd been holding their breath for the last 10 minutes and could finally exhale. This wasn't a rejection. It was the opposite. In their minds, I was a responsible man taking his duty seriously, a man who was savoring the moment before signing away his fortune to his loving family. Of course, Dad, Jenna said, her voice bright with victory. Absolutely. The office is just down the hall. Take all the time you need. We'll be right here. I stood up, my bad leg feeling stronger and steadier than it had in months. I took the leather folder from her hands. It felt like a verdict. I gave them both one last meaningful fatherly look. Thank you, I said, for everything. Then I turned and walked down the hall, the folder tucked under my arm, their excited, triumphant eyes burning into my back. They thought they were sending me off to sign my surrender. They had no idea I was walking away to sign their sentence. I closed the office door behind me, the soft click of the latch sounding as loud and final as a cell door locking. The room was just like I'd imagined, a monument to a man pretending to be important. A massive, empty mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, facing a wall of built-in bookshelves filled not with books, but with meaningless corporate trophies and framed photos of Derek shaking hands with people who looked vaguely familiar from local business ads. It wasn't an office. It was a stage. Fitting. I walked over to the desk, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps, and placed their leather-bound folder on the perfectly polished surface. I didn't open their folder. Not yet. First, I reached into my own jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope I had so carefully prepared. The one with the simple oak tree on the front. I slid my finger under the flap and took out the card and the cashier's check inside. I looked at the check for a long moment. $50,000. A future for my grandkids. A testament to the man I was, the values I held. It was a concrete gift, an act of love, and it was intended for a family that didn't exist. With a slow, deliberate calmness that I hadn't felt in years, I took the check in my two hands and tore it precisely down the middle. Then I tore the two halves into quarters, and the quarters into eighths, and so on, until all that was left in my hands was a small pile of confetti, the numbers and names and my good intentions reduced to meaningless scraps. I let them fall from my fingers into the gleaming, empty trash can beside the desk. Then, I turned my attention to their folder. I opened it, the thick paper cool beneath my fingertips. I didn't even glance at the legal garbage they wanted me to sign. I took Derek's heavy, expensive pen, flipped over the glossy, embossed cover page of their proposal, and used the blank side as my canvas. My handwriting has never been elegant. It's the rough scrawl of a man who's spent more time holding a wrench than a pen, but my hand was perfectly steady. The message was short. It was clear, and it was final. I wrote, Jenna, a word of free advice. Next time you and your husband are planning to have a father sign his own financial death warrant, you should probably turn off the baby monitor in your son's room. I heard every word. The part about me being pathetic was a particularly nice touch. The cashier's check I brought for the grandkids' college fund is in your trash can, in pieces. It felt like the right place for it. As of Monday morning, my will is being rewritten. The Family Legacy Investment Trust will still exist, but it will be in my name only. And its sole beneficiary will be a new charity I'm starting, a fund for skilled trade workers who get injured on the job. Real people who understand the real price of things. Consider this party, and all that came with it, your final inheritance. We're done. I didn't sign it. She knew who it was from. I placed the pen neatly back on the open folder, right beside my note, where it was the first thing they would see. I took one last look around the hollow theatrical room, and then I walked out, closing the door quietly behind me. The remaining guests were clustered in the entryway, putting on their coats, laughing, and making plans for the following weekend. Jenna and Derek were standing near the front door, seeing them off. They both saw me walking down the hall, and their faces lit up with identical, greedy smiles. They were expecting me to walk over, folder in hand, ready to complete the transaction. I can only imagine what they were thinking in that moment, the relief, the victory, the dollar signs flashing in their eyes. I gave them nothing. I didn't look at them. I didn't speak to them. I kept my eyes fixed on the hall closet, my face a perfect mask of calm neutrality. I walked straight past them, the ghost of a father they no longer had, opened the closet, and retrieved my worn work coat. I could feel their smiles falter. I could feel their confusion turning into a panicked, unspoken question. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jenna take a half step toward me, her mouth opening to say my name. I didn't give her the chance. I put on my coat, walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cool night air without a single backward glance. The sound of the door closing behind me was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. By the time I was settled in my truck, the engine rumbling to life, the feeling that washed over me wasn't sadness or anger. It was a profound, quiet, and deeply satisfying sense of vindication. It was the feeling of a job well done. I took out my phone, the screen lighting up my stoic face. I found Jenna's contact pressed and held, and tapped the block this caller option. I did the same for Derek. It was a simple, modern act, but it felt like slamming 1,000-pound steel door shut forever. I pulled away from the curb, driving at exactly the speed limit. As I reached the end of their perfect, sterile street, my phone buzzed. A call from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't have to guess. The frantic scramble had already begun. I let it buzz, the vibration of faint, desperate plea against my dashboard. I reached over and turned on the radio, and an old Tom Petty song came on, something about not backing down. I turned it up, loud, and I drove off into the silence of the night, leaving them to discover the beautiful, empty trap they had set for me and for themselves. The weekend that followed the party was quiet. My phone remained silent, a testament to the digital wall I had built. The frantic calls from unknown numbers had stopped after the first night. I imagine Jenna and Derek found the note in the office, read my verdict, and realized the game was well and truly over. The silence in my house returned, but it was a different kind. It wasn't the heavy, lonely silence of grief anymore. It was a clean silence, a peaceful silence, the silence of a slate that has been wiped clean, ready for something new to be written on it. For the first time since the accident, the money in my bank account didn't feel heavy or cursed. It felt like a tool, waiting for the right job. On Monday morning, I drove back to the credit union. I waited until I saw that Chloe, the young teller, had no one at her window. I walked over, and she looked up, a flicker of recognition and worry in her eyes. I gave her a small, genuine smile. "I don't need to make a withdrawal today," I said quietly. I slid a simple thank you card across the counter. "I just came to thank you. You took a risk for a complete stranger. You were a good person when you didn't have to be. You were right about everything, and you saved me from making a terrible mistake." Her eyes widened as she took the card. "Mr. Miller, I was so worried I'd overstepped." "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," I said. "You were honest." She opened the card, and I saw her breath catch. Inside, I'd placed a cashier's check made out to her. It wasn't a life-changing amount for me anymore, but I knew it would be for her. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up from the check to me. "I can't take this," she whispered. "Yes, you can," I said firmly but gently. "Integrity is a rare thing. It deserves to be rewarded. You put yours to work for me. Now you put this to work for you." She finally nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek, a look of profound, dazed gratitude on her face. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a feeling so clean and good it was almost startling. This was what the money was supposed to feel like. I spent the next 2 hours with the branch manager, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Gable. I told her I wanted to set up a foundation. I told her the whole story, not the emotional parts, just the facts. I told her I had a large sum of money from a workplace injury settlement, and I wanted to use it to help other people in the same boat. I had the name already picked out, Miller's Helping Hands. It wasn't just about charity. It was about practical support, helping an injured electrician get his van retrofitted with hand controls, buying a specialized lightweight tool set for a carpenter with a bad back, funding a retraining course for a mechanic who couldn't be on his feet all day. It was about giving skilled workers a way to keep their dignity and their purpose after their bodies had been broken. As Mrs. Gable drew up the paperwork, I felt a sense of rightness so profound it was almost spiritual. This was the real family legacy investment trust. My legacy wouldn't be a number in a bank account for my manipulative daughter to squander. My legacy would be in the lives of dozens of hardworking men and women, strangers who shared my story of pride and pain. Signing those documents felt more significant than any contract I'd ever signed in my life. The heavy money had finally found a proper job to do. The final scene of this story doesn't take place in my quiet house, or in that sterile bank. It takes place a month later, in the physical therapy wing of the county hospital. It's a place of quiet effort, filled with the smell of disinfectant and the sound of weights clanking and people grunting through their pain. I was there, sitting across from a young man named Sean. He was a roofer, maybe 30 years old, and a fall had shattered his ankle and his nerve. His face was etched with worry, not just for his body, but for his wife and his 2 young kids. I wasn't there as a benefactor writing a check. I was just there as Frank, a guy with a bad leg and a story. We talked about cars, about the Browns, about the frustration of a body that no longer listens to your brain. He told me he felt like his life was over. What am I supposed to do now? He asked, his voice cracking. I can't be on a roof ever again. I looked at him, and I saw myself from just a few months ago lost, adrift, and drowning in the silence. I leaned forward, my own leg aching in sympathy. The work isn't over, son, I said, my voice quiet but sure. It's just different now. Your hands still work. Your mind still works. The problem isn't the end of the road. It's just a damn tough corner. So let's figure out how we're going to take it. He looked at me, a flicker of something that wasn't despair in his eyes for the first time. In that moment, watching that small spark of hope ignite, I finally understood. I had lost a daughter, but I had found a purpose. I had lost the family I thought I had, but I was starting to build a new one, forged not by blood, but by the shared, honest pain of a life of hard work. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, genuinely rich. Frank turned his greatest pain into his greatest purpose. What did you think of his final decision? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.